This is an overview of cellular respiration. I like to think of cellular respiration as why you breathe and a lot of why you eat. If we think about the goal of cellular respiration, the most important one is extracting energy. Remember, Vicky is energy from food. I'm going to box that in this teal color. Teal color is going to indicate our inputs. And use that energy to make lots of ATP. Remember, ATP is a molecule, and I'm going to box the outputs in this kind of yellowish gold color. After we make that ATP, this is a kind of after cellular respiration. ATP, remember, that's a high energy molecule. I have a lecture about it. Is used to do cellular work. And that kind of work is things like cells moving or organisms, larger organisms moving, reactions, particularly building reactions, and active transport, moving molecules or substances against their concentration gradient. I mentioned this word electrons. You may have heard of it before. We abbreviate it E superscript minus. They are tiny, negatively charged particles parts of the atom. So an atom is the smallest unit of matter, but it's made of subatomic parts like electrons. Important things in our context about electrons: you can extract them from bonds. That's going to be important. That's how we're moving energy during the cellular respiration. And they can be used to transfer energy from molecule to molecule. When thinking about cellular respiration, you want to follow the electrons, because they travel, they flow through this process. So overall, we have the food we mentioned. Again, I'm going to box that in teal. That's an input. And really, we're looking at the bonds in the food. And remember, food is just carbon-based molecules. Molecules made of carbon skeletons and then other groups on top of that. And the reason I mention this is the carbon is the important part. So let's underline that in a magenta color. And what do we do with that food bonds? We're going to break off overall carbon dioxides, and that's CO2. to pull out the electrons. You can call that extracting the electrons. And from that process, or the processes that do that, we end up with waste CO2. And you'll note there's the carbon. So that actually comes from food. A lot of people think the gas comes from oxygen, but this carbon dioxide gas comes from the food you eat after you break it down. That's an output. So let's use that orange gold color again to mark the output. And what happens to the CO2? Because it's a gas, a small non-charged molecule, it just diffuses out of the mitochondria and then out of the cell to the air. And then it can be used by other organisms to do photosynthesis. All right, after we break off the carbon dioxides, and basically we're breaking bonds, and we've extracted the electrons, we're going to relay the electrons down the electron transport chain I have a lecture about that. We call that the ETC. It's basically just a bunch of complexes that can relay electrons. And the question is, why do we do this? This allows us to release a little bit of energy at a time. With each transfer of electrons. We can call it a handoff. So each time a complex in the ETC hands off the electrons, we release a little energy. And why would we do that? That energy is used to do active transport. And what are we transporting? Protons, or we can think of them as H plus hydrogen ions. These guys are positively charged particles. Part of the atom. Protons. And where are we putting these? Into the tiny intermembrane space of the mitochondria. It's important that it's tiny because it concentrates these protons. And that allows it to crowd the protons. Which means you have a lot of stored energy. We can call that potential energy, which we then can use to do work. And what work are we going to do? So now we've done work by releasing the energy from the electrons falling to pump the hydrogen ions across the membrane. Now we're going to do work with those hydrogen ions. We're going to let those hydrogen ions or protons flow or exit the mitochondrion through ATP synthase, a large molecule. That makes ATP. So let's look at this word here, ATP Synthase. And remember, synthesize means to build or make. And ACE means it's an enzyme. So this is just an ATP building enzyme. And how that works is that we take ADP, remember di means two, this is adenosine diphosphate. So if we think about it, the adenosine and ribose, and then we have two phosphate groups here. And in order to make ATP, we need a third phosphate group. And the ATP synthase can stick those together to make the ATP, the adenosine triphosphate. Tri equals 3. So it sticks that phosphate on the end and makes it a very high energy molecule. Especially that last phosphate, I'm going to draw some lines around it to equal high energy. And you recall maybe that those are the high energy is due to the negative charges of these phosphate groups repelling each other. And really the energy is stored in the bonds. The repelling makes the ATP more unstable, and unstable equals high energy. So let's box ATP as an output of cellular respiration, the most important one. All right, so now we've made ATP. Go back up here. What happens in the electron transport chain besides pumping the hydrogen ions? We make the other output. So oxygen, or O2, is an input in this situation. So this is why you breathe. This is it. And why do we need that O2? At the end of all these electrons falling down the chain, we need somebody to take oxygen, or to take the electrons away. So the oxygen picks up electrons at the end of the ETC. And what it does is it combines oxygen with two hydrogen ions, and that gives us H2O, or water. That's an output. The water is just a byproduct that takes the electrons away so they can continue to flow down the ETC. We got to take them away to give space for the other ones to flow. So following the electrons, they start into food bonds. Once we break those bonds, we extract the electrons, relay down the electron transport chain. Eventually they get picked up by oxygen and leave as water. The electron transport chain pumps those hydrogen ions across the membrane to crowd them in that intermembrane space. They get all crowded, and so they flow through the exit, which is ATP synthase. That ATP synthase then builds ATP, which is then used to do cellular work. And that's the process of cellular respiration.